Hello and welcome to ThePrint. We're here with Pushpita Prasad, who's the Chief of Communications at the Coalition of Hindus of North America. Thank you so much for joining us. The South Asian diaspora is one of the fastest growing, both in terms of influence and numbers. So can you tell us a bit more about CoHNA and why there is that need to make that specific distinction within the diaspora?
Absolutely. And thanks for having me. Appreciate the opportunity. So I'll just start off by saying I don't like the word South Asian. I think that saying the Indian American diaspora is a good enough term. India is today the largest population group on earth. It's very complex and takes a while to master. But I think CoHNA's focus is not specifically on any geographical identity. We are a faith-based organization. So we represent Hindus living in the US and Canada. Obviously, a bulk of Hindus come from India, but we also have members from Bangladesh, from Pakistan, from Nepal, from the Caribbean, and then a very active number of people who are second generation, sometimes even third generation kids that are growing up in the US or Canada. So automatically their identity is more based on the country they're growing up, which I think is a good, healthy thing. So I think that's our focus. And I think it's an important focus because there is a lot of conflation that happens everywhere between assuming Indian issues and diaspora Hindu issues. And while there can be some overlap, a lot of the issues we have been fighting actually are quite directly linked to the fact that Indian politics does not have a direct overlap into our lives. And we really resist attempts to do that. So.
I mean, how aware is the average American about caste when it comes to casteism? How much do people know? And essentially, what I'm asking that is, how is this kind of discrimination against Hindus different from racism in general or racial microaggression?
Yeah, so, racism is a problem. I don't think it's, it ebbs and flows. But I think that's there. The US that's a historical problem in the country. They're used to dealing with it. But when we talk specifically about Hindu issues, obviously sometimes we face racism, but that's not a faith-based targeting, right? What we are more focused on is Hinduphobia, which is when Hindus, and again, Hindus are come in all races. I mean, most of them are brown, but they are Hindus that are African American, they're Hindus that are white, so they again come in many different ethnicities. When we get targeted for our faith specifically, so sometimes there's an overlap because, a person being nasty may have more than one prejudice in their mind. But what we focus on is when a Hindu tradition or a person or an institution gets targeted simply because they happen to be Hindu. And that does happen a lot. And unfortunately, in recent years, a lot of Hinduphobia has come from people with similar race and national origins. So that's why this distinction of understanding what is the religion-based hatred as opposed to, racism is really important. That's one of the things we try to focus on a lot. To your other part of the question on caste, that's an interesting question. I can tell you I've lived and worked in the Bay Area for about 20 years. Never in my life in all those years, and I worked for a number of different technology companies in a number of different roles, and I have kids. So you're fully integrated into the American lifestyle. Never till 2020 had I heard the word caste thrown at us, with the frequency it is now. It was a very deliberate result of a strategy that had been put into place. And in 2020, two things happened that sort of suddenly mainstreamed the conversation. One was Elizabeth Wilkerson's book, quite literally titled The Caste, and it became like an international bestseller, remained, Oprah Winfrey pushed it. There was a lot of misinformation that certainly got mainstream because of that. And the second thing that very directly hit us, most directly, much more, was the lawsuit that the state of California filed against Cisco system and two Indian American technologists, Sundar Iyer and Raman Kompella. Specifically, that lawsuit just mainstreamed the discussion of caste in Silicon Valley, where I live, because suddenly, in 6 months, everyone seemed to be an expert on caste and would tell us about it, overriding our own lived experiences, overriding our own attempts to tell what was going on, because they just felt they knew it all. That lawsuit is really important because it wasn't just a normal lawsuit. California Civil Rights Department, they sue companies a lot of the time. That's not unusual. But this particular one was accompanied by like a severe PR blitz. So literally for the next few months, we saw hundreds and hundreds of articles talking about caste discrimination in the Valley. So much so that a lot of people, including Indian Americans living there themselves, right? If you ask them, they'll be like, yeah, I think there's a caste problem. And then you probe, you're like, oh, what is the problem you're talking about? Are you aware of anything? After a couple of questions, you'll get to the point. Everyone's referencing to some media article that they've read on it. And every media article is referencing back to that one unproven allegation against Sundarayar and Raman Kompella. So it kind of shows you the power of the state and academia to build a narrative out of nothing. Because as you may know, or as your viewers should know, that in 2023, that lawsuit that California filed against Ramana Kompella and Sundarayar completely disintegrated like a castle of cards. It was withdrawn with prejudice, which basically means, they were about to get sanctions. They really had no case to begin with. But the state had still decided to come after these two individuals and effectively conduct a witch hunt against them simply because of their background. That lawsuit was also very critical in motivating CoHNA to take on this as a topic, because when we read that lawsuit or what California had filed against these two people, we didn't know them at all. We didn't know who they were, didn't even, what the situation, what the specifics of the case were. For all we knew, they could have been they could have been discrimination. That happens, right? Bad stuff does happen in the world. So it could have happened. But what the lawsuit was not talking, just making like blanket allegations about Hinduism and Hindus in general. It was sort of assuming that because Sundar Iyer was accused of something, all of us were in the docket. And that is why my colleagues, my people in groups that I was in who had never talked about caste suddenly felt entitled to judge me, and based on my background, right? So there was a very broad brush with which that lawsuit was addressing the issue. It was also like, frankly, I think overreaching, because in the US we have a very strict First Amendment and a strict separation between church and state, which means a government, a taxpayer-funded body should not be defining religion. Effectively, this lawsuit was defining religion and telling us what Hinduism is and isn't. That's not their charter. They have no expertise, but that's not even their charter. So there was a violation of that. And the most disturbing thing, which is why I think everyone should worry about this, not just Hindus, is the assumption that you are guilty until you can prove yourself innocent. That is, so it's not a Hindu issue or an Indian issue or anything, right? Everyone needs to be very worried and ensure that they are seen as innocent until the state proves them guilty, not the reverse, because it's really hard to prove yourself innocent, which is why generally the principles of justice
is innocent.
But in the case of the Cisco lawsuit, not only were Sundar and Ramana considered guilty by the media trial witch hunt that they were subjected to, but we were all considered guilty because of that. Oh, there's that lawsuit. Oh yeah, Indians in tech, there's a caste problem. I'm like, if you look at this was first filed in the federal court, dismissed, then refiled in Santa Clara. And I'm like, if you go to the Santa Clara County courthouse, on a daily basis, a few people are sentenced. They're from some background or another. Are you going to say that, because of that background, everyone, like that whole community is, I don't know, fraudster, mugger, burglar, whatever, right?
Label them.
Yeah, you cannot do that, but you can get away with labeling Hindus with such broad brush strokes. And I think that is the epitome of the Hinduphobia that CoHNA fights, because, on the face of it, the community has done well, it has economic success, but we are very, very poorly understood because, we are a complex faith. Hinduism is a complex faith. It's hard to convey Hinduism in a 30-second soundbite, which is all that people have the time for these days. And, even Hindus don't agree on what we are. But we're sort of a round peg being put in a square hole because the Abrahamic world works on a few assumptions and we don't fit in those. And, that's fine. As a minority, you always have to make your space. That's okay. but you don't have to be settle for rank double standards, and you don't have to settle for being attacked for your religion. That's a huge violation of your rights as an American or a Canadian citizen.
Right. And like you said, this conversation has begun to enter the mainstream more recently over the last few years. I actually want to talk about sites where some of these tensions are felt more, viscerally, like on campuses.
Yeah.
What kind of work does CoHNA do with students, especially Indian American or immigrant students who move to the US to study for the first time?
So we actually have a youth division now, CoHNA Youth Action Network of, again, Hindu students, may or may not be diaspora students. A lot of them are second generation students.
Right.
And I think the work with students is really important, because when I talk about the caste issue, for example, some of the worst trauma and the impact is actually felt by the second and the third generation kids who are growing up there. Because in 6th or 7th grade across US, when you're in middle school, you learn world religions, okay? And when you learn world religions, there's generally a nice generic chapter on every faith, every major faith, right? Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Sikhism, Buddhism, Hinduism. Unfortunately, the Hindu chapter is taught through a very different lens. I like to say it's taught through the 3 C's: caste, conflict, and cows. And, it sounds easy as an adult if your audience is listening to say, what's the big deal? But put yourself in the shoes of a 6th or a 7th grader. This is a very fundamental time in your life when peer approval is really, really important. You're also a minority in most situations. I mean, I'm in California. Even in California, we're a minority, but you could be, the one brown kid in a small Midwestern town, right? And you go into school all excited, thinking that finally your school is going to give you some time. You're going to look at something that's related to your cultural roots, your traditions. And what you end up seeing is like a very horrific presentation of your religion, where almost, and I talked to this one girl who's now in her 20s, and she's like, the Hinduism they taught me in class had almost no bearing to the Hinduism I had spent the last, where she was 13 or 14 at the time when this had happened. She's like, my parents were very involved. I was used to go to the mandir, this and that. It's like literally no bearing. And the teacher turned to me and said, oh, can you tell us about caste? It was the first time this girl who was born and brought up in the US had heard the word caste. Right. And she was shocked. She didn't understand what was going on. And then later on, once they went through the lesson, her peers kind of used it as a way to bully her. And she didn't know exactly what to do at that time. It's not an easy hill for a 7th grader to climb. So this is something we see quite repeatedly. And I have counseled quite a few high school kids and college kids because they still carry trauma from those experiences. Unfortunately, now that trauma is following them into colleges, because now a lot of colleges have made caste a protected category. So that includes UC Davis, the whole California State University system, Harvard, Brown, Brandeis. I'll miss a few. But this conversation is now being forced onto campuses, and it's again a conversation that happens with no data, right? So in all these, since we started pushing back on caste officially in 2021, we filed our rebuttal to the Cisco lawsuit. It's still up on our website. You guys can look at it. But we just said, where's the data, right? You can't just make these allegations and say something is a huge problem without saying that it's a huge problem, especially since this is a category that's not neutral, right? So one thing that you have to remember in US laws and Canadian laws is the categories must be neutral. So I know, like in India, you have a Violence Against Women Act, right? But in the US, it just says gender is a protected category, which means a woman cannot be targeted for her gender, but neither can a man. It's both ways. So it's not like women are a protected category and men are not. Gender is, or sexuality is, or...
And discrimination on the basis of that.
Yes, and there have actually been lawsuits where men have filed lawsuits saying they were targeted for being men in a workplace setting. So that's one critical difference to understand. So in the case of caste, it's not in neutral, what we call a facially neutral category, because the way they define it, it only applies to certain parts of the world, which means I, being of quote unquote Indian or South Asian origin, is presumed to have caste, whereas my white neighbor down the road or my Asian neighbor down the road is not. So again, fundamentally, what are your opinions on the issue? you cannot have inequality before the law or in policy making. So these are some of the fundamental issues we try to bring people out and make them understand, because we find that caste is a word that is used to deny Hindus their right to speak up effectively. Because if you try to say anything, oh, you are being casteist, it's just like, it's a label that shuts people down very quickly. It's been thrown at me a lot, right? Oh, when we were opposing SB 403, why do you wish to discriminate? I'm like, I don't wish to discriminate against anybody. Existing laws are there for you to go and file a lawsuit against discrimination that has happened to you. But where are the lawsuits? There is none, right? In 4 years of this conversation, the only two pieces of evidence that have been offered by the people asking for these laws is A, the Cisco lawsuit, which has completely fallen apart now, and B, the survey that Equality Labs did in 2016, 2018. Now, I just wonder, why have they not repeated that survey, right? That survey has come under so much question for its lack of scientific, rigor, its lack of repeatability. There's a reason it's never been done again. And in the meantime, that survey was challenged by Hindu groups right away, pretty much the time it was launched. But it has been dismissed as inadmissible, that means not scientific, by California courts in 2021, because it was sought to be introduced as a piece of evidence in the Cisco lawsuit. It was dismissed, and it was also reviewed by Carnegie Endowment, which is a mainstream think tank in America. And they looked at it, and very politely they said, we don't think this survey is really applicable. And there's a whole bunch of statistical reasons why it's not. I'm not going to go into that. So you can't really turn one set of people into second-class citizens based on nothing, right? Like literally nothing.
Yeah, I just want to add some context. SB 403 is the anti-caste discrimination bill that was introduced by the state of California.
Yeah.
And also, I just want to add, there's a sociologist, Satish Deshpande, who's described this phenomenon called castelessness, where caste is invisible to those up the ladder and hyper-visible to those below, who are lower down. But in the US, where Indian immigrants are growing up within a very different context, these markers of identity can shift. But that leads you have done your own survey, right, which was done by Rutgers. It was done by Rutgers and CRI, and it's on DEI, and it puts forward some of these numbers that you're pointing to, the absence that you're pointing to. Can you tell us a bit more about that survey?
I'll just say one thing, because this is another allegation that is used to deposition anything we say, which is, this is an upper caste versus lower caste. It's not. The only casualty out of the SB 403 fight, and remember, casualty is a very serious thing, is from Milind Makwana ji. Milind Makwana was a Dalit leader who lived in Cupertino, a dear friend of mine, and we were there that night when he passed away. He spent since 2021, he had been fighting against this whole nonsense, and he was a Bahujan, right? And he was like, this is completely ridiculous, you need to talk to us. But the Bahujans and Dalits who oppose this are silenced. Milind Makwana, despite passing away, his death was not covered by any mainstream media. My own organization, CoHNA, one of our board members, Sudha Jagannathan, she is a Bahujan, and she is the one who led this fight for us in California. And Aldrin Deepak, a Dalit tech worker who lives in San Francisco, has lived there for 30 years. The San Francisco Chronicle has done 7 stories on caste, and it refuses to get an opinion from Aldrin, even though he knows them. He's had a 45-minute conversation with them. So these labels are put to silence us and to push, because this is coming from a very privileged set of activists. The accusation of privilege is thrown at us, but the biggest privilege in US is with Ivy League academia. And Ivy League academics are basically where this whole narrative is coming out of. So let's make sure we understand where privilege lies. So that's one thing. But I will come to the second part of the issue. So just last week, there is a group in the US called Network Contagion Research Institute, which is a research group within Rutgers University. And then there is another Rutgers Social Science group. So these are 2 academic departments within Rutgers. And they published a report on DEI last week, which basically looked at what's the impact of DEI trainings, because DEI has become a huge industry. Yep. It's a major driver for corporations, government, policy making, right? So they're like, let's just look at and they looked at 3 different: race, religion, and caste. I'm going to focus in on the caste because
Yes.
it got the least coverage because caste is not as mainstream in the US as it is here elsewhere. So on caste, and this is very quickly, I'll try to define the study. So this was a really well-designed experiment in the sense that they had a control group. I think they had like 876 people that were part of the study. They had a control group and a study group. And the control group read a statement, an innocuous description on caste that was put together based on the writings of various different academics. You can look up the exact names. And then the study group read something based on equality labs because and why equality labs? Because equality labs materials are basically what is used by the DEI apparatus, right? And then and then both groups were asked to review a couple of sentences. I'm going to quickly read the sentence out because I think it shows how innocuous it is.
Right.
So, Rajkumar applied to an elite East Coast university in fall 2022. During the application process, he was interviewed by an admissions officer, Anand Prakash. Ultimately, Raj's application was rejected. That's it. Now, based on this little innocuous statement, the study group assumed that the admissions officer is upper caste, the student rejected was lower caste, and they became more willing to assume all kinds of microaggressions, assume that there was racism involved, and be willing to punish the admissions officer. That is scary. Because again, remember the names I just read out to you: Anand Prakash and Rajkumar. And by the way, they even flipped the names, right? So at one point, Raj became the admissions officer. So simply because their mind had been prepped by what they read in terms of how Equality Labs describes Hinduism and caste, they were immediately willing to jump to the assumption of background, of there's no hint of background, and jump to the assumption that harm had been done and want to punish. This sounds to me exactly like what happened with Sundar Iyer, because remember, Equality Labs was the major co-sponsor of SB 403, the law that we fought off last year, and was also, quoted, was the only source that the Cisco, that the lawsuit relied on. So I think one thing last year when we pushed back against SB 403, one question came up again and again. Okay, we understand there's no data, this isn't really an issue. But what's the harm if we add another category to the 10 we already have, right?
It's another box.
Yes. And we just kept saying, guys, there is harm. Our students are getting traumatized. Our kids are getting disconnected. We are starting to get targeted in our workplaces. And look at what happened to Sundar. This academic research exactly shows that in a scientific experiment, you can replicate what the lived experiences of Hindus in US and Canada has shown. I think that's why this study is so powerful, because not people and the participants in this study were average Americans without any great South Asian understanding or background of Indian American and caste issues. But you can be so primed, and which is why I think it's even more scary, because unlike race and religion, these materials are falling onto a blank mind. And so people are completely convinced of what they read, right? And so once they do that, they're really not willing to listen to anything else. And so I think this study shows the harm. Another part of the study made the people read statements from Hitler, where the word Jew had been replaced by Brahmin. And again, the control group was fine, but the study group that had been exposed to Equality Labs literature actually ended up agreeing with Hitler's statements. Now, I hope people understand what happens when you have a set of folks who agree with Hitler's statements, because the Holocaust did not come out of a vacuum, right? The Holocaust came out of decades and centuries of caricaturizing and otherizing
Sustained
Jews.
discrimination.
Yeah, well, also words. Words are really powerful. Words are not empty, right? Words are weapons. Words can be weapons.
Yeah.
And so the persistent caricaturization and otherization of Jews over centuries and decades is what primed the conditions that led to a Hitler and a Holocaust happening, right? So you cannot look away or pretend that the hate that is being taught in schools, in colleges, being put into policies doesn't have impact, because it does. Now, we can't give you a direct, X said this and that means Y, but we know we have very recent history that showed what happened when you allow this kind of hate to go unchecked. So I think this study should really make people realize that this is not feel good, harmless activism. This is something which has serious consequences. And our ask as CoHNA, in fact, is that every place that has passed a policy needs to do a check and basically course correct. Because even after SB 403 was vetoed, even though the Cisco lawsuit fell apart, the policies that were created stay, right? So UC Davis, California State University, Harvard, Brown, Brandeis, so many other places, it continues to be a policy there. It continues to be a protected category in cities like Seattle. I can guarantee you many of your people who live in Seattle don't even know that this policy hangs over their head, right? City of Fresno. But Seattle is home to so many tech companies, right? And people there don't know, which is basically like you're in a situation where you could any normal sort of human interaction or conflict of opinions could become a caste issue. And I'm not making this up, right? Because this is what we were told at public hearing after public hearing when we would ask, what's the evidence? People would come up, the people asking for the law would come and say, oh, my roommate didn't allow me to share their utensils because they are vegetarian and I'm not. That's caste discrimination. Now, again, all of this falls into, skin color. So, you and I are sitting there, they'll say they're, based on this. So they've taken the American construct of race, because that's and put it on Indians and said, all upper caste are, and then the lower caste are dark skin, which is complete nonsense. You can put an Indian you can put somebody from the north with a tam bram and so there's no logic to this stuff, but it doesn't matter because you're talking about a group that's hardly known in the US. Most people aren't super interested in it, but they understand the race construct. And the minute you can say, an upper caste is the equivalent of a white and a lower caste is the equivalent of an African American, you've lost the point. And then even so, people like Sudha and Aldrin and they get, I think Shama Sawant effectively called them the equivalent of Uncle Tom. So you can just shut them up by no problems at all.
Well, I think that's all the time we have for today. So thank you so much for taking the time to tell us about the work that CoHNA does in the US and Canada. Is there anything else that you would like to add before we...
No, I would just say get educated, because my biggest worry is that there's so many Indians who go into the US and Canada, whether they're going as students, whether they're going as workers, and they don't, many of all of us are coming with this Indian lens of caste in our head. Let's leave Indian laws here when you go to the US and understand what you're dealing with, because it's a completely different paradigm and you don't even know. Most people may not know Apple, IBM, Cisco, Salesforce. So many of these major tech companies have caste as a protected category. So you as a manager might need to be very scared, because the next time you do reviews, by default, you can't give everyone the same review. So the person you give a lower review might come back and claim caste discrimination. The person you have a conflict with in a roommate sharing situation might come back and claim caste discrimination. Sharing of food, if you're a vegetarian, be very careful, because that is being marketed by equality labs as a marker of upper caste oppression. Again, we know in the Indian context this sounds ridiculous, but but you're not the one, they're the ones making policy there. Right. So be careful, go there, study, go have your jobs, but be aware of what you're walking into, because this stuff is policy at a lot of places. And you want to make sure that coming to the US or coming to the Canada does not mean you have to surrender your religious rights. This is a problem the Indian audience falls into a lot. It's like, America is a very religious country. You can be passionately Hindu, Sikh, Muslim, whatever, and you can be a passionate American. But somehow a lot of Indians seem to feel that the two identities cannot go together. So they get very defensive, and they may be walking into a trap that they don't realize. So be very careful of that, and reach out to organizations like CoHNA to understand what's going on, or to get help if you need to. That's what I'd say.
Well, thank you for taking the time, and thank you for watching.